Here.
Hello and welcome to the second ESEP webinar series in our fall series titled Talking Science with Non-Scientists. I'm Julia Smith with the Association of American Universities, and I'm joined today by David Goldston, the Director of the MIT Washington office, and Jennifer Poulakidas, the Vice President for Congressional and Governmental Affairs at the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities. Jen and David are going to share some ideas and recommendations for how scientists can best effectively communicate their work to non-scientists, and then we'll open it up for discussion and questions with you, our guests. You can submit your questions via the GoToWebinar tool, and we will moderate the conversation as those questions come in. So with that, I will turn to my friend and colleague, Jennifer.
Thank you, Julia. So it's great to be with you all today. We thought we would start with sort of the underlying premise. Should scientists talk science to non-scientists? What do you think, David?
Yes. We didn't even rehearse that.
And then, you know, sort of a natural follow-up question is why? Why have those conversations? Why bother? And I think at least one reason is to help non-scientists have a better appreciation and understanding for why science is beneficial and important to them and our world. Any other thoughts about why we should talk, why scientists should talk science to non-scientists?
No, but one thing that I'll talk about in a minute is you should be thinking about why would they want to know what you're telling them, right? If it's a request from them, that's even more important, or let's say the question comes up equally whether the meeting or interaction originates with you or with them.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And you know, and who makes up the world of non-scientists? Well, any of your non-scientist family or friends or community leaders or policymakers or people you happen to, you know, get into a conversation with on the subway or at the grocery store. So it really can be anyone, and having these meaningful discussions can be helpful to sort of the world of science and your fields. So now back to the main question, which is how to talk science to non-scientists. And I think David raised one of the key points. You know, why is this how did the conversation begin? Do you want to expand any more on that?
So people are going to want to talk to you I'm thinking mostly of policymakers here, or media, but it's true regardless. I mean, people want to know, everyone's busy. People want to know what your point is and why they need to know it, right? Now, that can include curiosity. They may just be interested. They can be interested out of personal interest. They can be interested because, in the case of a policymaker, it's in their jurisdiction, or because somebody in their area or agency or district would be involved in it. But usually, and most often, there's sort of a policy implication of the science, and so you really need to understand what that is. If you're initiating the interaction, you want to understand it because you're going to use that as the hook for the meeting to get them to want to take it, or a conversation if it's even something more casual than a meeting. And if it's something that they set up, you want to make sure that you're giving them the information that they need and that they want that's relevant to their question. But this is the whole feature I don't even know that I have. So
we don't have the rights to the music, so we're going to have to.
Okay. I usually think I don't have to worry about this phone because I don't get calls on it. And that wasn't a call. Anyway, sorry about that. A little comic relief. I tried to offer that purposely. Anyway, the other reason you want to know that, besides making sure you're providing what they want, you want a sense of how they will use it and also how they will hear what you say. So if they're coming in with a certain perspective or a certain angle, which everybody does, even if not on the specific issue, they will sort of take what you say differently. So you want to be sure you understand the full context of the conversation that you're having.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And David was also, parsed out, depending on who your audience is, the questions that they have for you might be just simple curiosity or might have consequences. In the case that it is a policymaker that you'll be speaking with, and I'll just throw out, if you're at a university, one suggestion that would be beneficial to both you and your institution is to check in with the government relations people at your university. Most research universities do have a government relations team, and they can help by providing you some context about who the policymaker is, provide you some tips on how to approach her, him, might even be able to get you some access to that policymaker. So it's a good idea if you're affiliated with the university, if you're a student or a faculty member, a researcher, a postdoc, try to check in with those officials at your university. If this did not come as a request from someone, if you're making small talk at a family picnic, or just trying to help maybe provide some insight to something that's important to you, to someone, when you talk, and actually no matter who your audience is, try to avoid using science jargon. Acronyms that you might be familiar with and might seem like secondhand to you are likely not recognizable to non-scientists. So avoid that jargony technical talk if you can, or you could spell things out and say, and this is how we talk about it in the science world. So just be clear that you explain all that rather than assuming that a non-scientist would have that information. I would also say any conversation is more interesting to people when they see themselves in the conversation. So if you can make the topic of interest to the person you're speaking with, there'll be a lot more likely chance that there'll be some reciprocity in an interest in the subject. So how do you do that? How do you make something relevant to someone? You could find out if they have a particular interest, if they've always been interested in maybe a certain disease, for instance, because they have someone in their family who suffers from a certain disease. You can sort of approach science from that angle. Or you could look at current events. Take, for instance, the storms that we've been experiencing, here in the U.S. And you could talk about how science helped us understand where those storms are originating from and where they're heading. Certainly, current topics tend to get people's attention and interest. So those are some other suggestions.
So a couple of things, a number of things building on that. So, and again, these are, I'm thinking mostly in terms of people in some kind of official capacity, whether it's media or policymakers, but it really can be, this really would apply to, these really all apply to anybody. So the first is, you really want to meet them where they are, right? So you really, the more research you can do on what they think, what they already know, how they think about the general topic, how they think about science, how they approach issues, how they learn more information, again, why they're interested. That's extremely important, and it can not only mean that you have more connection, but that what you say later isn't later misinterpreted, either purposely or more likely inadvertently. Second, one way to approach it, I think, always is sort of thinking like you're teaching a 101 level course, or whatever the equivalent is at different universities. And by that, I don't mean talking down to people, right? So it's not really good for a 101 level course either, but it's especially not good in these other situations. But what I mean is, many times the most important information they need are the things you take for granted, right? They're all the basics that you just don't even think about anymore, but when you're introducing somebody to the field, you make a point of laying all those things out. And so that's really important. And again, the more you know about where they are, the more you can decide exactly where with those basics to start. Third, I think you need to be open about uncertainty, but also clear on which things are scientists feel they actually know. So scientists tend to actually err on one direction or the other. In a policy forum, making it sound like we know everything because they don't want to leave an opening to whatever the other policy side is, or because they're emphasizing science is contingent and we're always learning things and it's really about asking questions, they make it sound like there's nothing we're sure of. And really, in terms of what the kinds of interests people have, it's neither of those things, right? There's a base that people are very certain of, even if they turn out to be wrong a decade from now, and there are other things where it really is quite uncertain, and I think you really need to be clear about that and open about that. You want to, as Jen was saying, sort of connect things to everyday reality as much as you can. You don't want to be talking down to people. You don't want to assume that anybody with the same information knowledge of you will reach the same conclusions about what to do with it, right? So a classic fallacy is if you knew what I knew, you'd think what I think, right? And that's usually a mistake, and a mistake on your part, not on the part of the person you're talking to. I guess I'll finish with one broad thing. So two other sort of categories of errors that people tend to make. One is thinking, and this one is about policymakers in particular. One is sort of thinking they're nothing like anybody else, and the other is thinking they're just like everybody else, right? And both of those tend to lead people astray. So these are examples from trainings I did with Leopold Fellows in ecology. Actually, these stories are probably at least 10 years old now, but still as relevant. So, in the thinking they're nothing like anybody else, there was a young woman scientist, ecologist, talking about making a point about pollution in a lake, if I remember, and she said, so all these students were taught, these were not students, these were faculty. Some were junior faculty, some were senior faculty. She was junior faculty. And they were all told to use metaphors, so that's always good advice, but the metaphor should A, not be used to explain something that's obvious on its own, and B, should not be more complicated than the thing you're actually trying to explain. So that year they were kind of awash in metaphors that were problematic. But anyway, she said, talking about the pollution, and she said, it's like I have, a 3-year-old at home and I have this white carpet in the kitchen and I have to keep things from spilling on the carpet. So after the session was over, I said, do you really have a 3-year-old at home and a white carpet in your kitchen? And she said, no. And I said, good, okay, because here's the thing. We didn't hear another thing you said, right? We're just sitting there thinking, like, what kind of idiot has a white carpet with a 3-year-old anywhere? Never mind the kitchen. These are normal people. They go through normal things, white carpet in a kitchen. That's the end of it, right? So, on the other hand, I think it was the same year, there was a very senior faculty member, happily I don't remember who it was, where he was asked, these were in mock hearings, so he was asked, if if we only have X amount of money, would you put money in X or Y? And it was not a broad choice. It was sort of this subfield or that subfield. And he kind of reared up in his chair and said, well, that's like asking me to choose between apples and bookshelves. And then sort of sat back very proud that he'd come up with something other than oranges. And during the review later, I said, listen, here's a real question these people have. Should I put the marginal dollar in this spending bill into the FBI, anti-terrorism, or to NSF? I mean, that actually was in those days because of the way, and I guess still is, because of the way spending measures are packaged. That was an actual choice they had to make. I'm like, don't you dare go and talk to them as if what a silly question. I have to make choices like that every day. Until you have to decide whether you're going to defend terrorists or give $1 to scientists, try to answer their question and not think you're superior. And so I'm still mad about it. And it was a fake hearing. Imagine if it had been a real one. So understanding sort of their world, you don't have to respect or certainly agree with the specific person you're speaking to, but you have to, it really is a matter of sort of respecting kind of the office and the situation they're in and why they're talking to you. So maybe why don't we stop there? When Jen and I were preparing for this, besides not knowing she was going to ask me questions, so we did decide we would try to keep the intro short because there's a lot of people on and we actually have, following our own advice, we have no idea what level different people are at or what kinds of questions you have. So why don't we open it up?
So one question I think that might be helpful, and maybe there's an experiential example that could be given, but I think sometimes people go into these conversations without necessarily understanding, and these would not be conversations with policymakers, but maybe with your, drunk uncle at Thanksgiving, not understanding the sort of implicit biases that are going to come out in those conversations, and then how to pivot the conversation to remain somewhat productive, and also maybe an example of a time where you assumed it was going to be a lot worse or more challenging, I guess, to make your case. And found a connection by bringing up a certain aspect of research or something that connected with a person that may have been unexpected.
Probably more examples in the other direction than something like that. So I think, you want to start, some of these things sound obvious, but actually doing them is hard, and actually in the heat of the moment, hard to think about. But you really want to start on the most neutral ground. So if it's a climate discussion, let's say, which is usually what people are thinking about these days, even though I should say climate is unusual because it's so connected to political philosophy these days, and it's really not, it comes up a lot, but it's also atypical in many ways. So you don't want to think of that as the model for everything. But let's say it's climate. You don't want to start with, so here's why those crazy people think that climate change isn't real or something. You basically, you want to, depending on what the entree moment in the conversation, you want to start with something open and maybe, for climate, if there's an opening where this doesn't sound ridiculously pedantic, you want to start with the fact that, scientists have known that there's a greenhouse effect from carbon dioxide since the 1870s, right? And you may want to start with something like, with climate, part of the problem is there's some things that are really clear that are based on long understandings, and yet there are a lot of questions that we still can't answer. And then that's an opening for someone to say, well, which is which, rather than starting actually just with, we know this. And so that's one thing. In terms of a science area where it proved easier, there's a policy dispute now which wasn't exactly on science, but it was about the conduct of science, which is on indirect cost expenditures at universities. So these are, the payments for, like to call it overhead, but for overhead expenditures. Facilities administration is the technical name. So you can see this is a long-time university lobbyist. And spend most of my career on the Hill and then at environmental groups. Where we thought that was going to be much tougher sell, and it was partly the circumstances, but the fact that it was connected to health research at universities, including universities in people's real own districts where they understand that this is work that their constituents not only benefit from but conduct. Mm-hmm. It's turned out to be a much easier sell this time than previously. Now, if it hadn't been packaged with other more controversial things, I'm not sure that would have been the case. But because it really became a discussion about the need for health research and all the things that health research entails and requires, on a bipartisan basis, it's really turned out to be much less of a fight and a much easier conversation this time than we had expected, than any of us had expected.
Okay. I don't have much more to add. On the keep the discussion productive side, I think that's just it doesn't help to start off with an argument. Mm-hmm. And even if the other person's maybe kind of gunning for an argument, you could really sway somebody if you continue to try to press a more productive discussion and find the paths that can lead hopefully to more understanding and appreciation for the science.
Right. I mean, keep asking them questions as you go, so you can feel where why do you think that? In that tone, now, why do you think that? That's not so productive, but you want to keep as many openings, and basically you want to have as many sort of exit points as you can. So you want to keep creating a landscape where you get enough information to have more paths forward as the conversation continues.
Okay, great. So this question comes from Deborah Stein. She asks, or points out rather, recognize that all scientists are not necessarily good communicators, even with training. How would you handle that situation? Using what I just said, if we could, I just asked Deborah since she's worked in that field. But so I think that's definitely true, and kind of in some ways the worse communicator you are, the less likely you are to recognize it because it's part of the same skills of awareness. So I mean, so if you're in a situation where you are deploying people, I mean, you really want to think about that. The other is try to think of other ways in which those people can be helpful. So you really don't want to we need as much help as we can get, right? So you don't want to tell someone just go back to the lab if you can avoid it. I mean, you want to think about how they may have information to help the people who are actually going to do the communicating. They may raise their own questions. They may have contacts that are the reason that they're involved. So I think you want to think of other ways to involve them, but it is true. You do not want to assume either that every scientist is a good communicator, or even among those who are, that everyone has to do that. I mean, you want to encourage those who can do it to do it, but it's fine for someone to spend their time as a scientist doing science. So you're really trying to take advantage of people who have both the interest or even at least the curiosity about it and the capability to be trained for it, but you don't want to dragoon people into doing it, and you don't want to send people out to the fields who are just going to be mowed down.
And some people have sort of varying communication skills, so some might
Good
not
point.
be great at presenting in front of a group of Lions Club members, but might be able to write an interesting or helpful op-ed. So playing to people's strengths
Right.
is.
Or they may be really good with someone who's already on one side of an issue, but not on the other, and that's fine. You just don't want them in both. You don't want them to say something to the one side that they wouldn't, be able to. I mean, factually that they would say differently to the other. But again, it's political in the broadest sense, in the sense, you're trying to create a relationship and make a connection, and you want to, it's a matchmaking exercise.
Yeah. I'd say there's probably a lesson too for folks listening in that aren't scientists but are in more of our position, where we can be resources for those that are interested. Jennifer started out early on by saying, if you're at a university, contact your government relations folks. We've worked closely in the past with a professor whose work was federally funded research that was dragged through a media firestorm because it's the topic of the research. And she actually, one of her biggest challenges was finding someone that would help her advocate for her research, because the message there was, no, go back to your lab.
Right.
And she's like, no, I'm not going back to my lab. Right. And so only then, when she actually became an advocate for herself and insisted that she was going to respond, did people say, like, okay, well, then let's give you the talking points that you need. So strong credit to her for fighting that fight. I think the lesson there is more for us to be ready when those tough conversations come, and you see that fight or media firestorm is coming regardless, to stick to what you know and to be that advocate and to help them be that advocate too, even if you know it's not necessarily always going to be an easy.
And one thing on talking points, they're helpful and they're a guide and somewhat of a crutch, but you don't want to sound like an automaton. If speaking to someone sounds the same as giving them a page of talking points, then just give them the page of talking points, right? Because it's a waste of their time, and you're actually going to hurt yourself. You actually, who you are should come across, and if that's passionate about an issue, that's usually, I know this contradicts in some ways, but people respond well to passion. Obviously, if you're passionately arguing against someone, you've got to deal with that. But don't go in trying to be, and this is true whether it's the uncle at the party drunk or not, or the member of Congress. Don't go in not being yourself, because that is something people will pick up immediately, and that's way more distracting than 3-year-olds and mythical 3-year-olds and white carpet, because then they're trying to figure out who is this person really and what are they really up to the whole time.
Yeah. So this question comes from Catherine Henley. Do you have suggestions on how to approach sensitive topics such as the use of the animals in research?
So, again, it's partly knowing where people start. If somebody's, a super activist on that topic, then, maybe you start with a question, or, again, you can raise a difficult question without it looking like you're just being contentious and provocative about, what would you do in this situation where this is why we use them. Or you can start with, look, we're trying to do everything we can to reduce use of animals, and that's actually thanks to the animal rights movement, which is true. Scientists weren't doing that on their own by and large. And here's what we have done. Here's what I think we still can do, but here's where I, have a problem. If it's someone who's more open, then, I'd start with a modified version of that. We're concerned about animal use, but, going right to, here's the problem we have. And often, especially, well, I don't know about often, there are sort of members of Congress, I'm thinking one in particular, a senator, who's very interested, very supportive of animal rights, but otherwise is, supportive of research, has a set of attitudes that are in no way contrary to where the scientific community is. And so, in that person, you want them, without going in and saying you should feel conflicted about this, you basically want to raise an argument that will make them feel conflicted between their different values. If it's someone who kind of values animal rights, that's their issue at their core, then, again, you want to have more of a conversation that starts with questions and bring that in. On all these, again, you want to think about why you're having the conversation, right? So, you don't need to have a conversation with someone who's going to be the last person on earth that will finally alter their view on this, right? There are other people who are more productive to have the conversation with. And sometimes you want to even back away from that conversation because you're going to get into a fight that's going to alienate the people who are more in the middle. So you really, you need to be, and this is even true, in the party situation. I mean, you really need to be, to the extent you can, strategic about who you're having the conversation with. Having the fight with the last outlier, like I said, is often not only not productive, but it's counterproductive to the rest of the conversation. It'll only make happy the person who's all the way on the other side, who you've already got and don't want to talk to anyway.
This question comes from Christine. How would you approach explaining concepts to people who say that they don't believe the evidence? Is there a way to redirect away from a belief-based perspective towards an evidence-based perspective?
So I think you want to, so that's a great question.
I'm not saying any of these are going to be easy.
Yeah, no. And as usual, when something's a great question, it's hard to answer. But so I think where I'd start with that, and again, I mean, in a real situation, you'd have to make sure this flows conversationally enough with what they mean by that, because people mean all sorts of different things by, first of all, people don't think in this category of this is fact, this is, I mean, that's a different world, right? They may instinctively be on one side of that. So you don't want to get hung up on the fact that they're using that language, number one, even though it is a signal to be careful. I think you want to ask what they mean, why, and then, from that, get a read of, is there a way to question that or bring up something in their world that may be, that they'd be open to. So there's some things where, if it's an argument over evolution and it's somebody who's got a true, dyed-in-the-wool religious belief on evolution, then you're probably not going to move that person. You may just want to move on. Most people, though, they mean something a little looser. They really mean, I feel uncomfortable with that, and nobody has convinced me it's not true, and I don't believe you because you don't share my starting points about discomfort. And so then, you want to basically think through that. And often people who claim they have religious qualms about evolution are actually members of religions that don't actually have a theological objection to evolution. So there may be things there. On climate, when people say, I don't believe, that's really just sort of more of a political statement. It's not necessarily belief in the sense of some fundamental value that they're not willing to listen to. So I think you have to find out what that means. It usually means I feel uncomfortable. My instinct is on one side. I feel uncomfortable with the people who are raising the other point of view, and I haven't heard anything that makes me feel open to it. And I think, again, in those situations, if you can find something to say, here's why you're right, but, so if it's GMO foods, yeah, I mean, it's kind of, scientists might not say scary, but, perplexing that we've changed, the biological makeup of a food, and you're right to be skeptical and maybe skeptical of the companies that are behind it, or it's reasonable. Well, you don't want to lie about that. Whatever you feel, you can go with. But we've actually had these kinds of tests, or the kinds of genetic changes are really this. So we've, again, starting with a place where you can get a sense of what they mean by belief, and are there points of intersection can start with before you diverge. And that's even true. I mean, the issue that I'd have the hardest trouble with is that, the anti-vaccine stuff, which just makes me incredibly angry. And it's, there too, I mean, it's obviously motivated by a genuine and wildly misguided concern about children. And so that's a place to start. And instead of talking about there are this many studies, which will not necessarily move people, especially if they think there's a funding bias, is there a commonsensical thing like the mercury, the thimerosal was taken out and it had no change whatsoever in, we've now got years where it didn't change anything about the number of cases of autism. I mean, other kinds of things where there's kind of a general logic thing that comes from the science, but is not a matter of sort of lording expertise over them or citing studies that they may have some reason to be suspicious about.
David included this in his response, but for sure, if someone is starting off with a belief statement, you want to be respectful of that, and not not cut that down at all. Even if you won't get to the same place, you can be respectful of where someone is and indicate, where you're coming from and what evidence has led you to believe, and just at the worst case, you can agree to disagree, but it's not going to buy you anything to push somebody into an even more uncomfortable place.
Right, and you want to pick your battles, right? I mean, if the belief statement is, I don't believe God would create a world that works in way X, then that may not be, unless you want to have a long theological discussion, which you may not be qualified to have, then that's not the place to spend your time. But like I said, belief often doesn't actually mean quite as much as the word would imply.
So this question from Delara, I think, pivots a little bit away from our topic, but is more focused on ESEP's broader mission. She writes, as a current microbiology, immunology PhD student interested in pursuing policy careers in the future, how do you justify to your primary research advisor that you want time to gain policy experience, and what types of experiences do you recommend?
Sure. So you are, I imagine, in a university environment, and certainly the way oftentimes the way university structures are arranged do not often lend themselves to students working on their PhDs and working in labs to take time off to have discussions about science, with policymakers or others. But if it can be relevant to the work that you're doing and to the work that's important to your advisor, they might see it as mutually beneficial. And so, again, finding a link, perhaps it's related to funding for research, so sort of that broader topic, or related to some of the specific breakthroughs that you're working on in your lab, hoping to get to sort of create new champions for research. That could be an attractive opening for your advisor to say, all right, you can take some time for that. And again, if you are doing that, it'd be good for you and for the institution to for you to connect with people who do this work on a everyday professional basis, so that they can provide you with important tools and help you put your talk together.
Yeah. So building on that, many of the same kinds of points. So again, I mean, you have to gauge the faculty member and how open and what actually interests them, and as Jen said, kind of the same as these other discussions. But I mean, obviously, one thing is to swear you will, still do all the things that he or she expects you to do, and even better if you can actually swear truthfully. But so I'd say a couple of things. One is really express, this is something I'm really interested in. If I'm going to stay in this field, then this is part of what I want my identity to be. And frankly, I mean, most science fellows that I've hired over the years and were admitted into programs, what they basically say for why they want to go go into policy, besides they have an interest in it, some of them say they have an interest in it, is, you know, I love science, but basically, you know, if I spent another hour in a lab, I would shoot myself, right? And basically tell your professor, you don't want to become that you're that person. Again, if that's an honest thing to say. Beyond that, in terms of, I'd say a couple of things. One is, look, I mean, science is drawn more and more into the policy world, more and more openly now, both in terms of the need for funding and understanding what's going on that actually is going to keep this lab in business. I want to do that. And what's going on actually is not mostly about what people think about science. It's about larger budget issues, and you need to know about that. And, you know, there are a lot of relevant issues related to our field, and who's going to, you know, we can't just sit around and say, how come these people aren't better informed about the immunology or microbiology that's related to this if the scientists who are best in that area won't contribute to the conversation. And if there's a specific ongoing issue that you know that your PI is interested in, that's obviously a good one to use. But, I mean, it feels like that you're not going to be short on examples. And I think, you know, there is more and more interest, I think, in most university administrations in having, that may or may not help with the faculty member, but more and more in university administrations interest in having grad students and faculty participate, even though they're not always as quick to change the tangible incentives. So I think those are the kinds of things, but I do think it's definitely worth pushing if it's an interest. In terms of what ways to start, I mean, so one thing to do would be, I mean, we're all in Washington, but really state and local issues, it's harder for them to get scientific advice than actually at the federal level. They're, you know, it tends to be less polarized and more practical, but not always. People like your advisor and so forth, it's something that they may see going on in the community. Usually can, I mean, some things drag out forever in any human endeavor, but sometimes there's a quicker, more direct payoff, or even the stalemate is more obvious faster rather than just being part of the system. So one thing to do is, are there local things you can do? And in some of the things we were referring to earlier, talking to local groups or just sort of being informed, not working on a particular issue, but helping inform people in the community about something in science you care about, or doing something with the schools, even though that's not by policy, but it's getting outside the lab and it's obviously helpful, and the teaching skills relate to every other kind of communication. So those are some of the kinds of things you can do. There are other things that are, if it's sort of in the state capital that's far away, or in Washington, I mean, there are things you can do in writing that then are, you know, you can control the time more, including writing a letter or an op-ed or something in your own local paper or on your own blog or whatever, so that it is local, which matters a lot. So there's lots of sort of, you know, ways to, you know, go up the ladder of engagement. If people are, you know, interested in going whole hog, then I do think the, you know, the fellowship programs, AAAS and the others, California has one for the state legislature, I'm on the selection committee for. Those are terrific programs, but first you have to finish your PhD, and again, you have to decide. Those are not necessarily for a career change. Many people go back to the lab, more people don't, but many go back. But you don't have to start with anything remotely like that level of commitment to get involved.
Great. Well, thank you, Jennifer, David, for joining us today. This conversation has been recorded. I'm not sure if we let you guys know that ahead of time, but it was, and it will be available.
No, you don't make us listen to it.
It will be available, I believe, on the Trellis platform, and will be circulated around in a few days' time. I think we have to render it. So thank you all for joining us. Sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions, but by all means, if you catch us around, follow up with us, and we'll be happy to.
Yeah, we can answer by email if they go through
you.
Or
sure, yeah. Or through Trellis, right? So thank you very much, and we'll see you all again soon.
Great. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, that was great.